Hi there, I'm Mike Matthews. This is Muscle for Life, and welcome to another episode. Thank you for joining me today for one of my departures from the usual diet and training escapades. This episode is for my fellow chin scratchers who like to don their thinking caps from time to time, because it's part of the non-fitnessy series of episodes I've been doing with Pat Flynn from Chronicles of Strength for a couple of months now, where we discuss philosophical things, religious things, political things, relatively uncontroversial, frivolous topics. And this time, it's actually a roundtable discussion because Pat and I are joined by Dr. Jim Madden, who is also into lifting heavy things, incidentally, especially kettlebells. But he is a professor of philosophy at Benedictine College. He is a prolific lecturer. He is an author of several books and has a PhD from Purdue. And in this discussion, Pat, Jim, and I get into consciousness and the philosophy of mind. Specifically, we talk about materialism and metaphysics. We talk about ethics and moral considerations, and particularly how harm can exist beyond just the physical realm. I get some of their thoughts on reincarnation and near-death experiences, and particularly on the scientific literature around these phenomena, which does exist and is probably more robust than you'd think. And so if you're like me in that you are not an expert in philosophy, but you do have an abiding interest in this area, and particularly in ideas that you can use to improve your life, practical concepts that can immediately improve how you understand the world around you, how you interact with the world around you, how you make decisions, how you respond to different stimuli, and so forth, then I think you're going to like this episode. Also, if you like what I am doing here on the podcast and elsewhere, definitely check out my sports nutrition company, Legion, which, thanks to the support of many people like you, is the leading brand of all natural sports supplements in the world. And we're on top because every ingredient and dose in every product is backed by peer-reviewed scientific research. Every formulation is 100% transparent. There are no proprietary blends, for example. And everything is naturally sweetened and flavored. So that means no artificial sweeteners, no artificial food dyes, which may not be as dangerous as some people would have you believe, but there is good evidence to suggest that having many servings of artificial sweeteners in particular every day for long periods of time may not be the best for your health. So while you don't need pills, powders, and potions to get into great shape, and frankly, most of them are virtually useless, there are natural ingredients that can help you lose fat, build muscle, and get healthy faster, and you will find the best of them in Legion's products. To check out everything we have to offer, including protein powders and bars, pre-workout and post-workout supplements, fat burners, multivitamins, joint support, and more, head over to buylegion.com/Mike. That's BUYLEGION.com/Mike. And just to show you how much I appreciate my podcast peeps, use the coupon code MFL at checkout and you will save 20% on your entire first order. Jim, Pat, I think this is the first time I've done a roundtable podcast. So I'm excited. Hopefully I don't hijack the conversation too much and talk over you guys a lot.
Well, it's an honor to be here, Mike. Thanks for having us on.
Yeah, it's definitely an honor. Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to it. So we're here to talk about consciousness, the nature of consciousness. And the reason this podcast came about for people listening is Pat and I, we have this kind of ongoing series of non-fitness discussions, and they usually come from just private discussions that we have. And then it occurs to us this might make for an interesting podcast. And I've continued to get good feedback on these episodes, and people appreciate the change in pace. So this one is obviously not just me and Pat now. We have the addition of James Madden, and I'll have introed you, James, in the beginning. But Pat, why don't you just quickly, because this was your idea to put this together, why'd you want to bring Jim into it?
Well, let me set the stage, right? So, Mike, we occasionally just hop on the phone and just have zany conversations that are always really enjoyable. And we kind of explore everything and anything. And we just started talking about consciousness one day. And I told you that kind of from my philosophical background, I've always really been interested in kind of metaphysics, but I peek a lot and I look a lot into what's going on in philosophy of mind. So I'm not a specialist, but Jim is. He's got his PhD in this. And funny story, Jim and I actually kind of swam in similar fitness circles, like the kettlebell world for a while, and never even knew it. In fact, he was doing kettlebells before I even knew what a kettlebell was. And then we got connected just through a couple philosopher friends because I was looking for a specialist in philosophy of mind to bring on my podcast. And a number of people said, you got to check out Jim, not only because this is his wheelhouse, but it seems like you guys have a lot of similar interests in fitness as well. So we've kind of just, had a number of conversations, had a blast. And then Mike, as we were on the phone, it just occurred to me that this seemed like a fun podcast idea. And if we were going to do it, we should bring in my buddy, Jim. You asked before we started recording why this matters. So I thought that
was what I was thinking. Maybe it would be, it'd be a question that I would ask. And just because I just tend to be an empirically oriented person, like I am most interested in what works. And of course, you have to unpack what that means. But for me, working, and we've spoken about this, Pat, that you could align that maybe in an Aristotelian way, saying, human flourishing. I agree with that concept. But if I'm taking it from a very personal, just not what's in it for me in terms of just my own self-interest. Like I do care about what goes on around me. I care about the society I live in, but I'm most interested in the results in the here and now, as opposed to promised results maybe in the future that, may or may not ever come to pass. And the here and now kind of sucks, but I'm sacrificing and I'm suffering through something here and now. Again, I wouldn't say that I'm an instant gratification person. I'm probably the other way around to a fault, honestly. But my idea of truth is inexplicably it's just tied up in what works.
You're something of a philosophical pragmatist, right? We've talked
and I'm not a philosopher. And again, I haven't read nearly as much about this stuff as you guys have, or even thought about it as much as you have. But I'm sure there are many people listening who also feel that would be a question. Like, why should I even listen to these guys talking about the nature of consciousness? What's in it for me?
Well, you might not be listening for long once we get into some of the more technical stuff. Yeah. So we'll see how it goes. Well, all right, let me just say a few quick things, and I want Jim's remarks on this, because he's been thinking about this in a much deeper way than I have for a much longer time. But I'll tell you what got me into it: being alive. right. That's what made me think that it was important, because we all have this sort of deep searching impulse, if you will, to know what we are, who we are, right? We kind of have these big existential questions that having kids has really made me appreciate. That whatever else philosophy is, it's just going back to those questions that you asked as a kid that most adults found annoying and told you to stop asking, right? But then taking them seriously again as an adult. And we all want to know who we are, right? And not just who we are, but what are we? Where do we come from? What is our destiny if we have one? What does it mean to live a good life, right? So these kind of like big questions. We have origins, meaning, identity, morality, destiny. These are the deepest, most searching, and I think most important questions that we can ask. And they're questions that arise, they're just occasioned in us. And they kind of have to be arbitrarily suppressed, I think. And they can be arbitrarily suppressed, and often are, by society or parents telling you to stop asking such annoying questions because they don't have the philosophical rigor to try and answer them for you. And kids are very good at asking difficult philosophical questions. I've had to open a number of textbooks to address my 5-year-old on multiple occasions. I'm just going to kind of punt to Descartes a little bit on this. And, I think Descartes recognized that the two most important questions you can really ask about life are about God and the soul, right? Because there's just a lot of not necessary consequences that come from establishing both of those, but at least potential consequences, right? Like if there's a God, then there might be some, greater purpose to the universe, and there might be some greater purpose beyond life here on Earth, right? And there might be some deep, intelligible structure to reality. There might be some greater objective meaning to reality, a meaning that we discover, not just invent. And then related to that, the human soul, like if there is a human soul, right? If we're more than just fermions and bosons, fundamental particles kind of whirling and whizzing through space, and that we might even persist after bodily death in some form, that has, again, it doesn't entail, but it has very significant potential considerations for what it means to be a human and what it means to live a good life if our existence is not limited to just the here and now. So this bears extremely on ethical considerations, even practical considerations, right? Of what is good for us, I think will often correspond to what is true. I don't think, Mike, that always what is useful is what is true. So I think I'd break with pragmatism there, because it might be useful for me to think that there's monsters living under the street, and that keeps me out of the street, and that stops me from getting hit by a bus. So that's useful in a sense, but it's not necessarily true. So I think there's a truth, as Aristotle said, is if you say of what is that it is, then you speak truth. If you say, what is that it is not, you speak a falsehood. So that's kind of the correspondence theory of truth that I hold to. But when I read Descartes, I realized that he just had the same sort of impulse and inclinations that I always had. For me, specifically towards metaphysics, but many people go to philosophy of mind because it just seems like God and the human soul seem to have hugely significant consequences on how we answer who we are, what we're here for, if anything, and where we might be going next. So I can't think of anything more important to think about, frankly. But Jim, I'd love to hear your thoughts on all this.
Yeah, sure. Much to say about this. First of all, in the way that Pat took the question, Immanuel Kant pretty famously, said in his first critique, there's really three questions worth asking. What can I know? What ought I do? And for what can I hope? Okay. And if you think of it, basically, he's asking, what can I know? He means, can I know that God exists, right? Can I know an ultimate cause of the universe? What ought I do? He's asking, are we free beings that are capable of like a disinterested morality or not? And what can I hope for? He's asking about the immortality of the soul. Is there an ultimate hope beyond this life for humans? Okay. I think the way Pat goes is, those questions are just intrinsically valuable, right? Partly to kind of be human is to kind of be troubled by those questions, right? And certainly, what ought I do has practical upshot, right? So I agree with Pat in everything he said there, but I want to kind of take it in a different direction too. All right. So there's a very prominent contemporary philosopher by the name of Charles Taylor, who likes to draw on a concept that comes from sociologist Max Weber about how really what characterizes our situation in the modern world is a kind of disenchantment, right? Or a disconnected sense, right? A sense that, we don't really feel at home in the world, in the environment that we find ourselves thrown into in a way. And this is distinctive about modern people. And Taylor and a lot of other contemporary philosophers in this vein argue that part of the problem with that is, or part of what led to that problem is an understanding of human mind, an understanding of human consciousness as something that is fundamentally disengaged from the world. Okay. And a lot of people, including myself, and I know this is armchair sociology that Mike, I would have a hard time proving, right? Think that we can probably draw a line from that disengaged understanding of what a mind is or what it is to be minded to our sort of, contemporary ennui or nihilism, wherein we find ourselves sort of lost in an indifferent universe. I don't think philosophy of mind or philosophy of consciousness is going to help you get ahead, right? Okay, I don't think you're asking that, but I can't say it's going to help you bake bread, right? I do think, though, there is this sense that we all have that we're missing something that our ancestors did have, okay? And a good hypothesis on that is that we might just be thinking of ourselves and our relationship to the world all wrong now. And that would seem to be a good impetus to kind of pick up the question of, what are we? What is it to have a mind? That sort of thing.
Yeah, I think of a book called All Things Shining.
Oh, yeah, by Dreyfus. Yeah, I had that in mind, yeah. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah. No, that's funny. Immediately, oh, yeah, write that book. What you were saying reminded me of that. And I was drawn to that book just reading about, okay, what's the pitch in the book? And that idea resonated with me because materialism just doesn't do it for me. If, like you were saying, Pat, if this is it, we're just a brain and the lights go off and there's nothing else to be said for us. I don't know if it would change the way that I live in terms of the day-to-day, but it certainly could in that it would certainly change my attitudes. And, I don't talk too much about my own religious ideas or ideas about spirituality, again, because I focus mostly on health and fitness stuff. But I would be willing to bet a lot of money that there is some sort of existence after death, that we are not just meat bodies spinning around the sun and then we just, go to the worms and that's it. So, just to add my own little piece on that, I think that there is a lot of hope and there's a lot of maybe inspiration that you can draw from coming to a position where you can believe in something like that. And how you get to that, there are different ways to get there, I think. And what is ultimately true, I agree with you, Pat. I do think there is an ultimate truth. Whether my ideas are correct or not, I'm not too concerned about it. I continue to seek for that truth. And ultimately, if I get it right, I get it right. And if I don't, well, I guess that's too bad for me. But what I can say is, practically speaking, just a very simple thing. For example, my current beliefs, which would be another podcast, but I have come to these positions through some personal experience and empirical thinking and reading and seeing what really resonates with me. But as far as what works goes, something that I benefit from is I don't take anything too seriously. And I say that in a way that not that I'm just careless, but maybe a bit more carefree. And not all the time, but I'm able to not take myself very seriously. I'm able to not worry too much about what's going on around me, be able to focus on what I can control, and maybe in a sense have a bit of faith that regardless of what is going on around me, that if I am not just my body, well, then what's the worst short-term outcome that can happen? I can die. Really, right? That's the worst thing that can probably happen to me outside of maybe having to witness things happening in my family, or if we're just talking about me though. And if that is kind of inconsequential in the scheme of things, it just frees up, I don't know, life force, I guess, where I can not have to be too concerned again about, oh, this is it, this is all I got, I better not make mistakes and be, I'm afraid of this, I'm afraid of the virus, I'm afraid of the stock market, you know what I mean?
Right. Yeah, so there's a lot there, Mike, and I think a lot worth reflecting on, but at one point you said something that resonated with me is, if it turned out that materialism were true, and just to give people a quick background, I used to be a materialist, right? I was an atheist for a lot of my life. And then through various arguments for God and for a type of dualism, which we'll get into, I gradually moved out of that worldview to where I am now. So I would say, like, if materialism turned out to be true, I don't think I would change the way I live my life now fundamentally. You'd might still
eat your vegetables, go to bed on time.
Right. So let me explain that, right? Because what I'm doing now is so much better. And I am flourishing in a way that I never was as the previous degenerate that I was. But here's the important point. Unless I was convinced that materialism wasn't true and experienced the life I live now, I would have never made that change in the first place.
Right.
You see the asymmetry there? I wouldn't go back to living how I was if materialism somehow turned out to be true. But I would have never got to where I am now unless I wasn't first convinced that materialism is false. Does that make sense to either of you two?
Yeah. No, I always put this to my students, and it scandalizes them a little bit, is, like, I could become convinced tomorrow, that God is dead and, kind of a narrow-minded kind of materialism is true or something like that. And that doesn't mean I'm going to go out and cheat on my wife that day. Right.
Right.
You know what I mean? It doesn't mean it changes anything about who I love. It doesn't mean it changes anything about what I find is the point of flourishing in my life and that sort of thing. Right. And I might not have what I think anymore is a good account of why those things are the case, but it wouldn't change, right, my commitment to those things. Because I didn't, and I really wonder how often this happens, right? I didn't argue, from a metaphysical thesis to my commitment to my wife, right? I didn't argue from a metaphysical thesis to my commitment to my children, right? It's really, I would put it in the opposite direction, is certain metaphysical theses explain better, right, my commitment to my wife and my children or something like that, right? And so I think a lot of times we assume the way it works is we do this heavy theoretical reason up front. We bring that to conclusion, and then we sort of choose a practical life based on that. I think more likely what it is we find ourselves with certain kinds of practical commitments, right, that we think it would be insane not to have. Then we try to figure out, as kind of an abductive inference, what makes best sense of those.
Right. That there are we're just drawn toward certain things, and it just seems to be inborn, and that's the phenomena that we can experience and observe. But then there's the question as to why. What is this?
Why?
Right. Yeah. See, Jim, I think I was just so much more of a natural degenerate than you might have been. Right. I think it's part of the problem, right? Because
we'll take that up off the air.
Yeah. So we don't have to get into the gory details, but there was a point in my life where it's like I would have thought that something was wrong, but if I knew in fact that I was the only one who was ever going to find that out, I would have done it. I would have done it. I would not do that now, and I would not go back to ever doing that, even if materialism were true, because I have experienced the other side, right? But I don't know if I would have ever come to even want to experience the other side unless I was first convinced of the wrongness of kind of my metaphysical worldview at the time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, totally. Interesting question, and this really would kind of become a social scientific question, right? If we wonder, okay, so here you are, you're Pat Flynn, and you've had this rational conversion where you have these principles that you hold based on a kind of a theoretical reason. and they make you not want to do, certain really naughty things anymore, right? Or not want
bad.
Yeah, they make you realize you ought not to do those things. But of course, people all the time do things they know they ought not do, right? Mm-hmm. And so we might ask ourselves, like, what is it that holds you to not doing those things when the temptation arises? Is it your commitment to the rational principles, or is it now this sort of existential emotional experience you've had to these other goods and other people, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I see what you're saying. I think for me, it's a both and, right? Because I guess, if you're coming from a naturalist, materialist standpoint, like I was, like, I have this conscience, but this conscience was just something that was fobbed off through the evolutionary process. It doesn't really mean anything, right? So if I violate it, who the hell cares if I get around with it? But then once you become, say, a broadly Aristotelian, and you couple that with theism, you realize, no, there's something about human nature, and there are certain things that are going to cause me to flourish as a human, whether I want to do them or not, right? And then you just add on the theistic layer, and I hate to say like God is watching type of stuff, but like I would be lying if it doesn't add some type of motivation. But my deeper motivation is the commitment to a Aristotelian essentialism, right? Understanding that there is a human nature, that my conscience isn't just some arbitrary thing that just haphazardly emerged, but it's something that really is trying to guide me in a substantive way. So for me, it would be, I know we're kind of veering off into ethics now, but it's a good thing to consider.
No, I think it's actually a really important philosophy mind question, because in the moment when you're thinking of doing, one of the naughty things, right? Is it actually the metaphysical story that prevents you from it? Or is it your emotional involvement with other people that keeps you from doing it? Do you see that?
I do, yeah.
Because it seems like you could very well know that metaphysical story, buy it completely at a theoretical level, and it could have very little effect on your life.
Totally.
Right. Yeah. You know what I mean? So
especially when it's so easy to do things and then be like, well, I'm still here. Everything seems to be fine. So,
exactly.
Hey.
And so I think a lot of what we do in terms of, like practical syllogisms, right? Like literally like reasoning, by way of deductive logic in practical matters, right? Is something we do retrospectively. Okay, so what made sense of what I did there, right? Here's this practical syllogism that does that. Was that actually what was moving me at that moment? Well, maybe who can know? And I would bet more likely it is these kinds of personal existential commitments that you had independently of the practical reason.
Yeah, I think it's a both and, but there's definitely a strong leaning. Like, when would I be willing to violate that existential force, if you will? Mm-hmm. I would be willing to violate it if I didn't think I had any metaphysical backup. Does that make sense? Even if it's the existential force that is the primary driver. Yeah. Sorry, Mike, is this getting way off track?
No. I'm listening. I'm just thinking, I'm thinking myself and through my own experiences. Again, you two are far more qualified and educated in this stuff than I am. So I don't have as many smart words and witticisms to add, but I'm just thinking through, because this is something that I myself have just thought about, that it's just an interesting quirk of human nature, is this point, Jim, like you were saying, and really you two have been going back and forth on. And I would like to believe, and I was trying to think through personal examples, I do think I could offer a fair case that I have improved consistently in this regard. It sounds like you have, Pat, as well. When, if I look back in my younger years, I don't think I would go as far as saying that I was a degenerate. And I'm a fairly harsh, brusque person. I'd have no problem saying that. My vice was probably porn. I would look at porn regularly, and it didn't get completely out of control. But beyond that, I've never cheated on... I started dating my wife when I was 17. I haven't cheated on her, never got into drinking. I've never done drugs. The standard kind of vices, never got into gambling. I played some online poker for a bit, but that was, again, it wasn't like a problem. So I'd say I probably did fairly well in that regard. But if I think of, porn, and I did get to a point finally where I was done with it, and it's been years, and I can say pretty confidently at this point that I will never look at it again. Not because every once in a while, there's still that little part of me that is like, it just would maybe enjoy it, but
the reward centers in your brain are still working, right?
Yeah. That's maybe a good way of looking at it, right? Because it is a very kind of hollow, it doesn't rise to urge or even compulsion at this point, because I feel like I've made such a decision. It's not going to happen. I don't care. You know what I mean? So there's maybe a faint whisper, and it's me just like, shut up. And that's kind of the end of it. But how did I get there? And so I was just trying to think, do I have something really useful to add to what you were saying? Just thinking through my own thoughts of like, what is exactly going on there? And I can speak to myself where there was, maybe it was a little bit of feeling bad about it because I didn't agree with it. Ethically, I just didn't agree with it. As a married man, I didn't agree with, I think the industry is disgusting and I think it is very harmful socially. And I think that by me simply looking at porn, I was contributing to it, even if it's just in a small way. And for me to then try to justify that in that's just saying, hey, yeah, it's just in a small way. It doesn't really matter. I know there's something false about that. It just doesn't work like that.
Right.
Similar to why I don't own Facebook stock. I don't own Apple stock. I don't own Google stock. I did at one point, but I actually felt bad about it because I really disagree with a lot of what these companies do. And so then I had to ask myself, why do I own their stock then? Well, it's in the scheme of things, what is my little bit of money? It doesn't matter. But that to me was like, that's just rationalizing. So eventually I sold the stock and I felt much better. And so I've gone through that process enough where I've experienced the reward of acting in line with what I feel is truly right and not just in my own self-interest. Again, trying to take a bigger, maybe a sphere of responsibility, maybe is the word, or trying to think with, again, the effects. Does Facebook or Apple or Amazon, Google, do they do anything to harm me directly, personally? No. But are they doing things to harm the world I live in and the society I live in? And that, of course, can affect me, but I don't like to see other people not do well. You know what I mean? So
yeah. I mean, there's so much there. Just a few things that struck me is sometimes people, I think, try to reduce ethics to something that I don't think works, whether it's just like physical harm or the idea of consent, right? Because people who want to say it's only wrong if it harms someone often ignore or beg the question against there being many different types of harm, right? Beyond physical harm.
I've gone in these circles with libertarians where it actually just frustrates me.
Right. Yeah. Or spiritual harm, right? So like this brings us back to philosophy of mind, right? If there's something else about us that is fundamentally irreducible to, again, the fundamental particles, and we can act in a way that sort of tilts us away or frustrates us from reaching a final end, that would be a type of harm that seems relevant to consideration, right? So it just really opens all the things that you could and should be considering, or the idea of consent, right? If something is ethical, if you're consenting to it, but I don't think that works because consent sort of floats atop deeper moral considerations. Like, for example, Mike, I can't consent for you to go drive my neighbor's car. I can't grant that moral permission, right? You see what I'm saying, right? Like whatever else consent is, if you're going to say that it's definitely not a magic wand that can just make any action moral, like I consent, whoosh, now it's okay. No.
Yeah, or I consent for you that you can take something I own and go beat my neighbor with it. That's not how it works. Oh, what is my property? I mean, I'm okay with it. I can give it to him.
If I consent to cut off my own arm, is that a good action? Right? I've consented to it. I think that most people would say, no, like you shouldn't do that. Right. So consent doesn't seem to have force in that situation.
And that's like, if you were a doctor, you're a surgeon and somebody says, hey, I consent to you removing my arm. Should you just be okay with it?
Right. Well, if there's things like principle of totality in ethics, the idea like if I need to remove my arm to save myself as a whole, then it might be morally permissible. But just say I'm just sitting in my basement, I'm totally healthy. And I'm just like, I just want to like Saw movie style, just start hacking off
something
my arm,
in me
right?
says just, my arm's got to go.
Yeah. People should hopefully restrain me like from doing that. Right. So again, I know we're kind of veering off into ethics here, but that's the fun thing about philosophy is like you can't stay isolated for long, right? You think about one area in philosophy, metaphysics, philosophy of mind, ethics, it's going to bleed over epistemology and spill into other areas pretty quick.
If you like what I'm doing here on the podcast and elsewhere, definitely check out my sports nutrition company, Legion, which, thanks to the support of many people like you, is the leading brand of all natural sports supplements in the world. Let me ask your thoughts, both of your thoughts, on research into reincarnation. I'm sure you're familiar with, was it Stevenson, and now it's Tucker, UVA, and then I recently learned about somebody else. And in the case of Tucker and Stevenson's work.
Right. And Raymond Moody.
Right, yep. And just for the listeners not familiar, I'll just give a quick. So if you look at Stevenson, I believe it's Ian, right? And he was a psychiatrist, and then now Jim Tucker has carried on his work. They have several thousand cases from all around the world, usually with young children, talking about past lives, past existences, giving very specific details. And then the last I had seen, they have over probably close to 2,000 solved cases. So you have some kid in Bangladesh, 4 years old, who will say, oh yeah, my last life, I was Mary Sue. 22 and I was living in Illinois, and I had a husband, Petey, and I had kids, and then they go verify, and you go, well, okay, what's going on here? And again, I believe it was near almost 2,000 cases. What are your thoughts on what's going on there?
Yeah. This is going to open up a can of worms, but let's do it. So this will also tie into near-death experiences, which Jim and I discussed a little bit on the first time I had him on my podcast. And I don't know if we disagreed or agreed on that, Jim, but it was fun. Yeah. So a few thoughts on this. Let me say one thing about science, right? The attitude of the scientist should always be to serve and accommodate the data. Right? Whatever the data is, right? But that isn't often the attitude of the scientist. Often the scientist brings in their philosophical presuppositions and tries to force the data into it, right?
What was the little quip? It progresses one funeral at a time.
Science, it does typically, right? Yeah, one generation of funerals after another, right? That's how progress is made.
Because the ideologies finally just die off with the people who refuse to consider anything else.
Right. And my general view, and I've spent a lot of time, especially when I was working through all this philosophy of mind stuff, reading the research and the literature on these phenomena, reincarnation, near-death experiences. And I don't mean going to Barnes & Noble and grabbing some new age book out of the clearance bin. I mean like peer-reviewed studies and journals like The Lancet and stuff like that, right? And my view is that, some of these, whether we're talking near-death experiences or
out-of-body stuff.
Yeah, out-of-body. I think some of these definitely can be given a sort of natural explanation, but I think some of them definitely can't be. And I'm more familiar off the top of my head because I was revisiting it somewhat recently of the near-death experiences where, you have somebody who flat EEG, fixed and dilated pupils, cardiac arrest. They have this experience, right, where there's little to no brain activity and they're able to report sensorial knowledge, veridical data. And veridical data means data in the outside world that is then later confirmed by independent researchers, right? So there's two things to mark there. One, it's pretty remarkable that people have any type of rich experience when they're being declared clinically dead. That itself is interesting, but it's really hard. But, maybe you might want to get around that and say it's just kind of the last huff and puff of a dying brain and they're just hallucinating. Well, then you have a problem when you're getting veridical data reported, right? Because hallucinations don't give you veridical data. It's a totally private, subjective experience. So if we have people reporting things like stuff on the roof of the hospital that they would no way be able to see.
Yeah, that's different than the DMT elves.
Right, yeah, the DMT elves or the giant worms or whatever, or conversations that were going on in other rooms or the type of surgical equipment that another doctor in another room was using simultaneously with the operation they were undergoing. Like stuff that okay, this is, and look, there's ways that maybe you can explain one or two instances if you think some big con is going on. But I think when you look at the overall swath of the data, you run out of naturalistic options pretty quickly, right?
May I make a point about the veridical nature of some of the information that you're finding in near-death experiences?
Yeah, please.
This literally happened to me this morning. Okay.
You had a near-death experience?
No, yeah.
During your workout? Yeah, that's how you know you had a good workout, right?
That's right, yeah. So this morning, my wife tapped me on the back to get me to turn off the alarm, right? Okay. And I experienced that as a waking from a dream, right, of someone tapping me on the back, right? Do you see that? And in my memory, though, right, the tapping was antecedent to the later
it's like
event.
the effect preceded the cause almost.
Yeah. And so and it wasn't my wife in the dream, okay, but I very easily could have post hoc interpreted it while asleep, right? Had an experience of Jen tapping me on the back that was veridical. Do you see? It'd be very easy for that because memory is not a photographic record of things. Memory is our interpretation of things that have happened, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. There's an interesting literature on that, right? And so, say the near-death thing, there's always ambiguity. And that is when I wake up from, say, a dream, I always wonder, did the dream actually unfold over the temporal sequence that I experience it? Or do I just wake up with a memory of a temporal sequence?
Yeah.
Right. Right. And
whereas I just say, well, that was a weird dream.
It was a weird dream. Yeah.
As they almost always are. Yeah.
Exactly.
This is the hellish world I'm locked in, though, Mike. Right? Okay, so you see what I'm getting at here is that turned out to be kind of veridical, right? And we could have said, whoa, Jim had this sort of external awareness, he was unconscious but still conscious, and there was something really weird going on here. No, what happened was I got information after the fact that I back interpreted into this dream, right? And now, once again, I'm not saying there's probably very good sciences studying the near-death thing, but that all would have to be teased out for me. I really don't know how you could do that, right?
Maybe I'm just being dense, but I still see what Pat was saying in that maybe I'm just missing the connection here of something that's subjective, a dream. Nobody can say that you did or didn't have the dream versus, oh, this is what they were talking about in the other room.
And that's why I like my theory to be humble about it, right? I think that there are, first off, I agree with everything Jim just said, right? Clearly that phenomenon goes on. I think that does, and very plausibly could explain a number of these claimed experiences.
Very subjective things.
I certainly don't believe all of them, right? And I don't think anybody should. I think you should just be
and those ones were never very convincing or appealing.
You should be a healthy skeptic, but not a cynic, right? Where if the data keeps piling up and piling up. So I think based on, again, my prior commitments that I think I have very strong independent reasons to affirm, like Jim was talking about, right? Which we all have those prior commitments. I think given the existence of God, but also given the way that I think of the human body and the soul, and given we would probably expect more near-death experiences if it was not in harmony with Jim's phenomena. Yeah. But I think the occasional ones is sort of a quote unquote miracle, if you will. Yeah. That kind of makes sense to me. So that's why I lean to that. And then the reincarnation, since I'm not inclined to that, angels and demons, people are going to be like rolling their eyes at this point. But again, it all goes into deeper considerations. If they exist, and presumably they would be aware of many different things throughout the history of the world and able to influence us in various ways, to the point of maybe even convincing somebody, right, that they lived a past life. So that's how I try to accommodate the data without denying or ignoring the data. I don't know if that's true, but to me, it does seem like a plausible way to make sense of the data, if that makes sense.
By all means, you have to go with what the background theory is here, right? Unless it's just so been massively disconfirmed, right? Okay. And so I think a lot of this has to do with what you've got in your back pocket, right? My point would be, though, is if someone doesn't have that in their back pocket, it seems to me we're not close enough to saying, looks like we're going to have to go supernatural here. Right?
I see.
That's
interesting.
And I'll tell you, like, there's that case I read about once in a near-death experience where it was the kid was aware of a pair of shoes on the roof of the building, right? Okay. That's a tough one, right? Okay.
Right.
Because presumably the kid never been on the roof of the hospital.
Yeah, I think I remember that one, and he described the shoelace color and everything, right? Yeah.
Yeah. But then again, so also then now, if you want to get into, there could be natural telekinesis and all this stuff, right? Okay. But then it seems like you're stretching natural to the point that the natural world is so freaking cool. I don't care about the supernatural distinction.
Yeah,
anymore, right?
They become indistinguishable. It's almost like a continuum. Like, oh, cool. So we just keep going, and now we are Jedi? Oh, fine, whatever. I don't care. That just sounds fun.
Yeah, I like that a lot. The other thing I just wanted to highlight about this conversation, I know we've been going for a while here, is a few things that struck out to me is there's value in figuring out what something isn't, even if you don't quite know what it is. That is valuable and can and should have consequences on how you live your life and how you think about other things. And I think we've spent a lot of time on that. And also how much prior philosophical considerations bear in on how somebody is going to interpret or attempt to accommodate the data, right? And I'll just give even the example of Christianity is I think you can give a strong historical case, right, for the historical kind of signing off signature of the resurrection, right? But I don't know if I would have ever really accepted that if I didn't already convince myself of classical theism philosophically first. You see what I'm saying, Jim? And same way, if I was still a committed naturalist, probably I would have just gone for any ad hoc stories I could have, right? And the truth is I just never even considered it historically until I already became a theist, right? Because I was what's the point, right? And same thing with these near-death experiences and reincarnation is I have other commitments that I think are tight, independently motivated, and that it would take a lot to dislodge them.
Right.
Yeah.
That, okay, even if there's some anomalies here and there, do I still have the resources to accommodate those anomalies? And I think I do, even if I don't quite know exactly how it works in every instance, if that makes sense.
And something I can appreciate, I've asked this question to you. I think it's an interesting question to ask people who are very politically identified, motivated, and then also religiously. What would have to happen for you to make a marked change in your position to...
That's an important question. That's a very
great question. Yeah. Go ahead, Jim. Why don't you go first?
No. Finish your question, Mike. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that was basically, it's just I find that question interesting to ask people, to think about myself and my positions on a lot of this stuff. Like, because if there isn't an answer, then that to me is a red flag. If I'm talking with somebody, especially these days with the political climate, it's a bit wild, whether they're hard left or hard right. I've been doing this now more, and it's interesting that I've yet to have, like when I asked you, I was asking about Catholicism, Pat, which is in a private conversation, and you had a very quick answer. And I respect that. And I just find that in the discussions that I've had with people since then, and I've been using that a little bit, it's not common where someone can say, here's how I would disprove this to myself, and I'd have to go looking for something else.
Okay, so, I'm a Roman Catholic too, right? But if someone could demonstrate to me that in fact, like St. Peter really was like part of an infant sacrifice cult, and he pulled this off as this great trick, if you could show that to me be true, I would not be a Catholic anymore. I hope, right? Do you see what I mean? I've said this to people and they're like, well, you could never know that. I'm like, that's not the point. If I knew that, you know what I mean? Like I think for a belief to be a meaningful belief to me, there's got to be a falsifiable condition.
I'm with
right?
you 100%.
Otherwise it is just an irrational commitment, or it's an empty, trivial commitment, right?
Right. So, here's the great thing about Catholicism is it makes itself eminently falsifiable, because all we need is a Vatican III to come out and formally teach that we no longer believe in the Trinity. There we go. The church is not indefectible. I would give it up. Like if that happened, I would give up Catholicism 100%.
There'd be a self-reference problem there too.
Yeah, right. And one thing that struck me about Catholicism, when you seriously investigate the claim of indefectibility and the essential teachings of the church, you notice a striking consistency, even if there's a development that you kind of wouldn't expect if the Catholic Church wasn't what it claimed to be. Anyway, that struck me. But even in theism in general, God's existence, people say, well, you can't disprove God. Yeah, you can. You just show that the idea of God, the notion of God as subsistent being itself, is contradictory in a sense. It entails some type of logical contradiction. And people often push the problem of evil as one such thing, right? If you say that God is this supreme foundation and he's all good, then why is there evil in the world? And they claim is that that's incompatible, right? Now, I don't think that's true. I think there's a number of moves to show that isn't incompatible. Good moves, as I've talked about on my podcast many times. But if somebody could show something like that, and this actually goes into an area that I have specialized in, which is coherence of theism, right? That there's something incoherent about the notion of classical theism, and you could demonstrate that to me with some type of airtight argument, that would be a defeater, right? I would give it up. Now, I've spent a long time in that. I don't think that there is an argument like that, and classical theism still stands, centuries and centuries after people trying to take it down, that I think it's like, I feel very confident in it, but I'm willing to say, yeah, you could take it down, right? Mm-hmm.
And just to quickly interject there, whereas that may sound fuzzy to people who aren't as well versed in this stuff as you are, Pat, because when we say, well, yeah, you guys are throwing around a lot of words though, and there are many branches to all of this thought, and you could probably figure out some way to just not accept that there's a logical contradiction. I'm not saying you would do that, but your first answer was something that is very objectively verifiable. It either happens or it doesn't happen. And you may think there's no chance that it happens. And I'm just complimenting you.
Yeah, no, it's the latter that would actually be more clear cut.
For you, no, I know. I'm just saying for people who they haven't read a single book on any of this, I think that there's just an immediate appreciation of something like, okay, a Vatican III. And I'm sure you could name off different things where like very specifically, here are the positions that I would say are non-negotiable for all of this to work. And if any of that changes.
So take something like, for Christians, take something like the Trinity, right? That's a dogma of the Catholic Church. And people always talk about being dogmatic like it's a bad thing. Well, it depends where the dogma comes from, right? If it's from God, then we have good reason to believe it, right? But yeah, the church says that's a dogma, right? We're committed to it. And the idea of the indefectibility of the church is that, God guides his church, often through very fallible people, and protects his church from formally binding its members to any error, any falsity in the essential matters of faith and morals, right? Well, if we've believed in the tradition that God is a Trinity, right? Complex topic. We can talk about it some other time if anyone's interested. All we would need, right, is that the church, convenes a Vatican III and it teaches with full authority and it changes that teaching. It says, nope, we're actually just, we're Unitarians now or something like that. I'd be out. I'd be like, okay, I was wrong, right? I really thought I was right. It seemed like we had some good momentum there, but maybe I'll just go be a broad Neoplatonist or something at that point, right? I don't know exactly where I would go, but that would do it for me, right? Jim, I don't know if you agree with that or not, right?
The reason why I brought that up is, Jim, your original example to me would sound like, well, that's just kind of inventing, I know you weren't doing this, but I could see someone say, yeah, you're just inventing some absurd thing that could never happen. How are you ever going to prove that St. Peter was raping babies and killing babies? Okay. As if you're not arguing in good faith, you know?
Right. Yeah. No, I just wanted to say the most scandalous thing possible.
I understand that. That's like where I like to go with things too.
And I do think though, what that line is got to be this thing that's like in this like important place in the heart. Right. Okay. But yeah, I approach a lot of this stuff very differently than I think Pat does, right? Even if we come out in much the same place, right? And first of all, I want to go back to your original point, Mike, the idea that if you don't have a bottom line at some point, or at least you admit there could be a bottom line without my knowing right now what it is, I wonder to what degree your position is just unhinged entirely from any pushback from reality. Mm-hmm. We have to test what we're claiming against something outside of ourselves. That's the very distinction between, being delusional and living in a real world, right? So even if I couldn't say to you right now, I know what would get me to, like, even I have to say there's something that would cause me to walk out of my marriage, even though that's the most important commitment I can make. And I can't envision what my life would look like now without her. But unless it's just I'm a member of a personality cult from my wife, there's got to be some condition that I would say, we can't have that. I'm gone. You see that, right? And I don't know what that is. It would have to be really damn bad, right? Okay. But if I'm not just a robot programmed by my wife, there has to be such a condition, right? Wittgenstein, it's one of his famous throughout lines is, if you can't ever be wrong about something, there's an important sense in which you're never really right about it either. It's not a rational commitment now, right? And some of this might not like sit terribly well with things I said earlier, because I say like we're kind of just thrown into these commitments, into a world, into emotional attachments and practical skills that we didn't choose, but were kind of foisted on us, right? And it seems like we can never like fully separate ourselves from that, right? Those are like what let a world come to be for us. I think in a very important literal sense, I don't know how I would make sense of even very simple things if I lost Jen, right? Or not just lost her, like she's going to die someday, but lost her, like it turned out it was all a sham, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, but that being said, right, even though I don't know how I would make sense of things, right? I don't know what that possible world is like where Jen turns out to be a sham, right? And sweet, I'm not suggesting this. Even if I don't know what that possible world looks like, okay, the fact I think that I can entertain it, right, that there is such a possible world, right, is sort of like kind of what separates me from being a machine. Okay, so things like my commitment to my wife, things like my commitment to the church, things like my commitment to my friends and stuff like that are things that I am willing to say could be complete failures. Unlikely, I think, but could be complete failures. And I have to be willing at some point maybe to put that stuff into some kind of critical scrutiny and questioning, wherein I might have to throw out my whole operating system. You know what I mean? Like those are kind of my hardware. Those are like what let a world come to be for me at all. And if I lost those, it'd be as if I'm just, spinning water, right, with no contact to reality anymore. And I think the fact that I can put my whole operating system in question is a very important fact about human beings. That we are capable of a kind of just really cruel self-scrutiny about our commitments and things like that other things are not.
And that can be a very practical thing as well, just being able to stress test your ideas. I think that in my experience, I'm thinking now maybe more a bit entrepreneurially, just in my business and work and having worked with many people and then just socially interacting with many people, where sometimes I get a little bit confused how people behave and the actions they take. And like, did you not think about like, okay, you had this, what I would say was a very naive conception of how things were going to go. And it was very much not rooted in reality. Did you ever think a little bit about it? Maybe do a pre-mortem, I guess, so to speak, of this is what I want. How might this go wrong? And then compare that to the ideas that you had starting out. And so the ability, though, to do what you're saying, if you're willing to do it, I think has very useful implications for just living a better life.
Yeah. And
I don't think if you never do it, you're walking through your life like a robot.
Right. You gotta know when to quit at some point, right? And but at the same time, I almost kind of admire people who don't have it, but know they don't have it and admit they don't have it. Right. Yeah. So like I
think that's a way of having it, actually. Right?
Yeah, it kind of is, right? So there's a guy I actually like. He's a hardcore atheist materialist. His name's Peter Atkins. You know what I'm talking about, Jim? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, right. Like he's hilariously dismissive of religion. He's got this very charming British accent, and he engages a lot of debates and conversations conversations, and he believes some really bizarre stuff. So I think he's definitely wrong, but I enjoy him. I like listening to him. And there was a conversation, it's on YouTube somewhere, where somebody asked him, he's like, what would you need to do to change your mind? Is like there anything that would change your mind to get you to reconsider your kind of physicalist, reductionist worldview? And he just says no. There's nothing that could do it. There's nothing that could do it. And I was like, bravo, dude. Like, at least you aren't putting on any pretense that you don't have. And I just really,
Thomas Nagel had that moment too.
Yeah, with theism, right? What was his quote again?
He said,
famous philosopher, right?
Yeah. I mean, Nagel, in his book, The Last Word, like he comes out, he's defending objectivity, morality. He's defending, all these, like a non-reductivist view of the mind, really almost dualist, all these things. And towards the end of the book, he's like, you might wonder in what sense I'm a naturalist. And he says, well, I am, but why? Well, because he says, I literally have a fear of religion, right? He says, I just don't want to live in a universe that's run by a God, right?
Yeah. I just don't want God to exist. Right.
Yeah, and that's close to
I like
verbatim,
that. At least the self-awareness,
I like it,
know. And some people might feel the same way. So like, that's my guy.
No,
exactly. It's the honesty that I so appreciate. Right?
I remember telling a buddy right after I read that book, like, there it is, Thomas Nagel, the last honest man in American academia, right?
There's no truth to that. Yeah, he's a brilliant guy. He's definitely, especially on the philosophy of mind stuff, right? He's got a lot of really important work.
And in the day-to-day living, I mean, there is some similarity to that. I mean, again, I've had discussions with people and gotten down to why did you make that decision? Like, how did that work? And in many cases, it did come down to a fear of something or just a desire that they, even if they analytically or rationally just couldn't really explain it or work it out, they took the action because of that, and they're dealing with the consequences, and that is what it is. But it's interesting, and it makes me think of something that, I don't know, it's not my idea. I picked it up somewhere, but it has just stuck with me, and it has been useful for me. Is maybe I've honestly gone in the other direction a little bit too much. Like, my personality now is maybe a bit unemotional, quote unquote, to a fault, but I have gotten to a place where maybe I came through the skeptical of emotions, and I place very little value on feelings that I can't explain. I feel like I can't make a good argument for based on something that is empirical or something that is rational. And it's been useful in my life. It's been useful in my work. It has driven me to work a lot more than maybe, people have been asked many times, why do you still work as much as you do? And why don't you, quote unquote, enjoy your life more? And so anyways, those are just some rambling thoughts that come to my mind related to this point specifically.
It kind of going in a direction with that, Mike. There's this notion of a mood that comes up in a lot of 20th century phenomenology and existentialism, right? And the idea is if, let's say, I'm afraid, I'm walking home, it's around Halloween on an October night, and I'm having a sense of fear, I'm going to notice all sorts of entities that are really there that I would not have noticed if it were not for that mood. Like, you notice that rustle in the leaves, you notice that, the sketchy guy in the clown costume, okay, like all these things that you probably notice no matter what, but you notice things, or like the fact that, I'm so enamored with my wife makes me notice all sorts of things about her that are really there, but no one else would notice. When you're in the mood, right, you see that little curl in the hair you might have missed or something like that. You see what I mean? And so there is this precognitional emotional background that really does play a very important role in narrowing what we can perceive in any given situation. In any given situation, there's infinitely many things we could perceive and cognize and make claims about. Part of what narrows that is these kinds of like emotional backdrops. And I think, this is very speculative, but a lot of people will make these kinds of cases, is it's these non-cognitional emotional commitments or cultural commitments, right? Worlds that we occupy that make a cognizable world become available to us in the first place. And without those commitments, it wouldn't come to be, right?
It'd be crazy, right?
Be crazy, yeah. Okay. And so this is kind of like my relationship to Catholicism is I didn't make some big like rational choice to do it, right? Like Pat's experience is different from mine. I was raised Catholic and then like fell away, in my 20s. And then when I got done partying, came back to the church, right? Which is just to say I'm Irish, right? So, all right. Like the babies came like, we got to raise the kids somehow. Right. Okay. And I'm not saying I don't think it's true or something like that. Right. But it wasn't an inference. Right. Okay. That brought me to it. It's part of what has made a cognizable world available to me. And it's because of my commitment to that which I can't necessarily defend in any cognizable way, that there's a lot of entities that are really there that come available to me. But of course, I have to admit, I got thrown into that. I didn't really pick this, right? Okay, I'm just stuck in it. And that means at some point, I do have to have like a critical relationship to it, but it's not a critical relationship that brought me to it. And the fact that it does make a very meaningful world available to me that is really there is something in its favor too.
I like that, right? The sort of the restrictedness that's necessary, if you will. And
I think to say that you're going to live without emotional commitment is to say you're going to live in a complete chaos.
In chaos.
In any situation, there are infinitely many true propositions you could affirm. There's infinitely many true statements you could make in that situation, right? A minuscule subset of them are relevant. What sorts the relevance? Well, practicality is what we're doing sorts it. Our mood sorts it. Our moral commitment sorts it. Our other kinds of religious commitments sort it for us, right? And I think we do need something to sort the world precognitionally so we can have a cognizable world at all, right?
I take your point. And to follow up with what I was trying to put together is, I suppose, and this is me again, I haven't really thought about this. I'm just thinking about it right now and just letting words come out. But I suppose where I agree, and I think that minimally, if I experience emotions that I feel are not suitable to, let's just say it's a proposition of doing something, right? Or experiencing some situation. If I feel like my emotional response to that is, it doesn't make sense to me, or it's going to be unproductive, I'm quick to reject it, almost, and see it as a threat to my well-being, essentially. But if it's an emotion that seems suitable to the circumstances, even if it's not a pleasant emotion, then, I'm willing to embrace it, I guess. And that to me has worked. I've just noticed that has seemed to work out fairly well for me.
No. And executive function, man, right? That's it.
The one other thing I wanted to ask Jim about that I appreciate about what he said is that there is that moment, and this is philosophy, right? Is where you do become critically reflective, right? And I think that is to be a philosopher, right? It's a critically reflective, systematic investigation of just our own experience, but then how do we set it in relation to the whole? That's philosophy, right?
It's ultimately good science too. I mean, at some point, the Newtonians had to put the whole damn thing into question in order to get relativity. Do you know what I mean? There had to be an openness that the whole thing might be deeply flawed. Right.
But there is also, because sometimes people will use that as an objection, typically against religion. Well, Jim, the only reason you're Catholic because you were born into it, right? And you know what? That might be true. That might be the only reason, but it doesn't show that what you believe is false. The
only reason I heard the leaves rustle on my walk home is because I was scared, right? That doesn't mean they weren't really rustling.
Right. So you could just have, like, just because I'm born in a time where, certain authorities tell me that the earth goes around the sun, and that might be the only reason I believe that the earth goes around the sun, doesn't mean that it's false. Right. So it just means that, we can be born into certain contingent circumstances that for most people are going to contain a mix of probably a great degree of beliefs that are closer to truth than others. But we need that to focus our interaction with the world, if you will, right? We need sets of restrictions, which Jim is talking about. But then there comes a point of maturity, I think, of being a philosopher. We then turn back, reflect back upon these assumptions, these commitments, this precognitional context, and we start probing it. And we ask, is it true? And we might find that some of what we were just born into is true. Some of it isn't. We give it up. Others is an approximation, but we need to refine it. Yeah, that to me is that's being a philosopher, right? That's being a human.
So my pet chameleon, Bob, whom I think you've heard about before, Pat, right?
Big fan of Bob.
Actually, I got to get you a picture of Bob. Right?
Text it over.
I will. He's magnificent, man. Anyway, so
I didn't know he was real. That's hilarious.
Oh, he's real. He's real, man. And I have an inordinate attachment to Bob. So
that's great.
It was supposedly a gift to my son, but I've just co-opted it. Anyway, so Bob the chameleon, lives in a world, right? And I think there are reasons in that world. But I think there's a reason why Bob hunts the way he does, right? There's a reason why Bob drinks the way he does, right? And any given activity he does, we can look at that and say, it makes sense what Bob is doing. He has reasons. But what makes those reasons available to Bob is entirely just his non-rational involvement in the chameleon world. He can never make the reasons explicit. He can never do something because that's the right thing to do, even though he's constantly doing the right chameleon thing. We're different. We mostly operate by the implicit reasons provided by our biological, cultural, emotional, religious, political, whatever background that we just pick up, right? But we can also make the reasons explicit. We can sit back and ask, okay, but what really conceptually makes sense of this? And once you've done that, now you got a problem, because now you got to ask, is that how it really is? And I think that movement from the implicit to the explicit, from the merely practical to the theoretical, although I think it's all tied back, is the distinctive human moment, right?
Yeah, that's great. And I don't know, maybe that's where we tie this one up, but
oh, and by the way, that explicit implicit thing, that's Robert Brandom, not me. I don't want to take credit for that.
yeah, but for anyone who's interested, Mike, if you don't mind, Jim and I had a really great, pretty long discussion more on this topic, philosophy of mind, on my podcast. If anyone wants to maybe get a little more clarity on some of the stuff we're talking about, I could also, Mike, just send maybe you a list of just articles and resources for anybody who might be interested in reading more into these debates.
Yeah, that was actually going to be the question I was gonna throw out to you guys, is for people who are still listening and who want to,
God bless you, yeah,
and who are intrigued. Maybe you guys have top 3 or 5 resources, and I would say that I would assume it's someone like me who maybe can follow along, doesn't know too much about this stuff, maybe can ask some questions here and there. What would you recommend? It could be books, it could be articles, it could be podcasts, interviews.
Plug yourself, Jim.
Okay.
And yes, if it's your own stuff, please.
I have a book called Mind, Matter, and Nature that came out, was it 2013? And in that book, I'm staking out a kind of a position a lot closer to Pat's position than my position currently, right? But it'll give you a good start on basic philosophy of mind, and especially in the kind of context that we've been talking about it today, right? And I have a lot of lectures that are on SoundCloud for something called the Thomistic Institute. And I could get you links for those too, where I give you a lot of stuff I've been talking about much more slower and in detail. But they're lectures for popular audiences.
I would definitely recommend those. In terms of like beginner stuff, you know what? Ed Fazer's got a good book that's just called Philosophy of Mind. I'd recommend that. I think that's a pretty accessible introduction. He kind of scans the different schools of thought there. In terms of, articles and argumentation, my friend Josh Rasmussen's been publishing. He, if you want to hear something kind of different, but in addition to what we've talked about, Rasmussen's got a very interesting argument. It's called Against Non-Reductive Physicalism. He calls it the counting argument. And what he does is he shows that there's a greater quantity of mental categories than physical categories, and uses Cantor's theorem. So it's pretty technical, but it's a pretty sweet argument if you want something a little more advanced that I think is a good argument. So there'd be a beginner and a more advanced recommendation. Let me try and throw maybe one more out there. You read one recently. Are you friends with Thomas Bogardus, Jim?
Mm-mm.
He's got an article just called Undefeated Dualism. It's published. It's not totally new, but I think it's a good article. Anyway, I'll send you the links, Mike, if you want to just put them in there for anybody who's interested. Mm-hmm.
Great. And then otherwise, people can find you, Pat, over at chroniclesofstrength.com, right? And then you mentioned you have a podcast, but what's the name so they can find it?
Yeah, so the podcast, which we're going to be getting Jim on again next week. So if you want,
once again, I'm co-opting.
Yeah, if you want more of these kinds of
friend of the show,
if you want more of these kinds of parties, it's called the Pat Flynn Show. I talk, a good amount about fitness, but we also do a weekly segment on philosophy and theology. Occasionally talk writing and music and stuff like that. So it's a generalist podcast, and the humbly and originally named Pat Flynn Show.
I like it. And then Jim, what about you? Where can people find? Because you have books on the stuff we've been discussing here. You have a fitness book, which I'd actually like to follow up in another interview.
Oh yeah, I would love to talk about it.
And talk about how to get more jacked.
That's right. There we go.
But where can people find you and your work?
I have a mostly dormant Facebook account.
Cool. You're busy. I understand.
It's not. No, you could very easily overestimate how busy a college professor is. Don't believe the hype, right? I'm actually at work right now in some sense, right? So Pat and I have talked a bit about how deep I want to get into the social media, and especially on the fitness side of it. And I'm happy to talk to people about philosophy and stuff. So they can find me on Facebook under James D. Madden, and I'm happy to, please feel free to message me there.
Cool.
I have an email through Benedictine College where I teach, right? They can feel free to hit me there. And I do have an almost untouched Twitter account under the title Being Real. They could probably find me there too.
Yeah, Jim's going to have some awesome fitness content flowing out here pretty soon. So I'm
philosophy.
pushing him to enter to the dirty, grungy world of online marketing, Mike. So we'll get him there. Yeah.
I've just got
make the Faustian bargain. Just accept it.
Yeah, just do it.
Rock on.
Yeah, no. And I have really what it is Pat and I talked about quite a bit, and there was a vision there. And then there's this last book about what I'm talking about a lot with us today that it's almost done. It's like just one more run through it and I'll be good.
Nice. So, that's exciting. I know how that feels.
Yeah, you know.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, awesome, guys. Hey, I really appreciate both you taking the time, and it's been very interesting. Again, I've had fun listening and thinking about my own experiences and trying to find things that resonate with me, or, you know, I've tried to contribute to the conversation as much as I can.
No,
but
you have.
Again, thank you for lending your expertise. And, you know, I look forward to, Jim, again, we should put together another interview. Let's talk about some fitness stuff, and then
I'd love to do it.
Pat will figure out something to talk about in the next installment of this eclectic series of interviews that
you know I love it, Mike. I'm always down.
All right, well, until then, thanks again, guys.
Thanks, gentlemen.
All right, well, that's it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it and found it interesting and helpful. And if you did, and you don't mind doing me a favor, please do leave a quick review on iTunes or wherever you're listening to me from, in whichever app you're listening to me in, because that not only convinces people that they should check out the show, it also increases search visibility, and thus it helps more people find their way to me and learn how to get fitter, leaner, stronger, healthier, and happier as well. And of course, if you want to be notified when the next episode goes live, then simply subscribe to the podcast and you won't miss out on any new stuff. And if you didn't like something about the show, please do shoot me an email at mike@muscleforlife.com, just muscle, F-O-R, life.com, and share your thoughts on how I can do this better. I read everything myself, and I'm always looking for constructive feedback, even if it is criticism. I'm open to it. And of course, you can email me if you have positive feedback as well, or if you have questions really relating to anything that you think I could help you with, definitely send me an email. That is the best way to get a hold of me, mike@muscleforlife.com. And that's it. Thanks again for listening to this episode, and I hope to hear from you soon.